Good evening, dear friends. Good evening, dear guests. I'm very happy and honored to see all of you with us today at Apéro Géopolitique independent discussion platform, which we created with the Swiss University of Applied Science Institute. We created it to raise the important geopolitical questions and to deepen understanding of ongoing processes on our planet. Today's topic is Arctic, the new strategic frontier of the 21st century. I will shortly introduce why it's so important, because the melting ice is opening new sea lines, untapped reaches, and the race for control. Russia is dominating with bases and icebreakers. The USA eyes Greenland as the ultimate outpost, and China pushes the polar Silk Road into the high north. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the Arctic is no longer a scientific sanctuary. It's the next front line of the 21st century power politics. And I'm very happy to introduce our experts today. Ambassador Branson McKinley, diplomat of the State Department, former ambassador, Director General of the former Director General of International Organization for Migration. Thank you for being with us today. We have special guests who come from Denmark for Apéro Géopolitique discussion on Arctic. Dr. Flemming Spielbøl Hansen is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies and a leading specialist on Russian foreign policy, European security, and Arctic geopolitics. With over 2 decades of expertise, he provides in-depth analysis on the strategic shifts shaping the Nordic-Baltic region and Europe more broadly. And Hicham Lehmissi, a geopolitical expert and lecturer at Swiss University of Applied Science Institute. Hicham Lehmissi is a regular columnist in different international media. He's the author of Apéro Géopolitique in Annemasse, which we are creating also in Geneva, Apéro Géopolitique. I would like to emphasize that we are here not to criticize any government and their actions. We are here to understand what is happening in the world. And me, Kati Kojurari, I have been working in journalism for 20 years. I'm a book author, Building Peace, Moldova, Sweden. So, I remind everyone that our discussion will last 45 minutes, my questions to experts, and 45 minutes for you, asking questions to the experts. And then we will have Apéro networking session, and because it's the end of the year, we invite to, let's celebrate, let's say Christmas. I kindly ask experts to keep answers 5 till 7 minutes. And we are starting. My first question will be to Hicham Lehmissi. So why Arctic looks like El Dorado today, like a golden rush? So why it's becoming so important? And who are the biggest pretenders to the Arctic and Transpolar Road?
Très bien, merci Cathy. Alors bonsoir à tous, good evening to all. Welcome, donc bienvenue à la Swiss University of Applied Science. Donc particulièrement pour ce moment de fin d'année, qui est un peu notre dernière apéro géopolitique de l'année et qui va nous permettre en fait de faire un petit point important du point de vue géopolitique sur une région qui tend à gagner de plus en plus d'importance au sens stratégique et géopolitique du terme, à travers donc la région dite de l'Arctique. On est en train de parler d'un territoire immense, c'est 14 millions de kilomètres carrés dans son ensemble, et en même temps extrêmement peu peuplé, c'est 4 millions d'habitants seulement. Et aujourd'hui, tous les regards sont pointés sur la région de l'Arctique. Alors pas seulement parce que le président américain Donald Trump a réitéré sa proposition de vouloir intégrer le Groenland dans la fédération des États-Unis, quitte à la racheter, ou peut-être même par voie militaire, a-t-il sous-entendu, mais pour toute une série de raisons que l'on va présenter, tout en apportant quand même un bémol, c'est-à-dire sur toutes ces visions qui présentent justement l'Arctique comme un Eldorado. Les choses sont un peu plus compliquées que ça, parce qu'on est rattrapé en fait par le milieu et les difficultés de la géographie. Alors pourquoi on parle de l'Arctique comme sorte d'Eldorado, c'est déjà tout simplement parce que l'on pense et l'on considère à travers un certain nombre de diverses études que la région de l'Arctique concentrerait, en termes de réserves non prouvées, c'est important de le mentionner, des ressources déjà en hydrocarbures très importantes. On considère, alors il faut que je donne la source, la United States Geological Survey, l'USGS, que 13% des réserves de pétrole non découverts au monde se situeraient au niveau de la région arctique. 30% du gaz naturel non découvert, donc c'est quand même une dimension qui est particulièrement importante si elle devait être germée. S'y ajoutent également des ressources critiques, le nickel, le cuivre, tous les métaux stratégiques dans la révolution industrielle et technologique que nous sommes en train de vivre. Et au-delà de ça, toute une dimension liée également aux terres rares. On considère qu'il y a des réserves très importantes de terres rares au niveau de l'Arctique. Donc déjà, ça c'est une dimension qui est importante à prendre en considération. Et si on parle des grands gisements de terres rares, ça nous renvoie directement au Groenland, avec un certain nombre de sites alors j'aimerais les citer, mais j'ai peur de faire une erreur. I'm afraid to do some errors. If I say Ilimausok, Kvaneshveld, non.
Perfect.
C'est parfait. Oh, super. Citronel Fjord, c'est ça. Et qui sont considérés comme ayant ou disposant un potentiel majeur en fait en termes de terres rares, mais également en termes d'uranium, donc dans la dimension nucléaire. Mais par contre, et là j'apporte un bémol, c'est que par rapport à tous ces espoirs en termes de richesse en fait existante au niveau de l'Arctique, on a déjà eu en fait des opérations menées par un certain nombre de grandes firmes multinationales. Des concessions ont été attribuées notamment au Groenland, et la plupart ont été abandonnées, soit parce que les forages pétroliers étaient infructueux. On a Shell qui a quitté tout simplement l'Arctique. Donc il y avait des investissements qui se chiffraient en milliards de dollars. Des projets miniers qui ont été arrêtés pour des raisons techniques, en raison des conditions environnementales extrêmes. Il ne faut pas oublier que si vous devez creuser sur le continent, enfin sur l'île, ce sont parfois des dizaines, voire des centaines de mètres de glace qu'il faut perforer. Donc on a quand même une contrainte physique qui est considérable. Et puis également le fait qu'une bonne partie de ces eaux, lorsqu'il s'agit de l'offshore, sont gelées toute une partie de l'année. Donc on a une dimension, une contrainte géographique très importante qui fait que même si d'un certain point de vue on sait que de grandes réserves énergétiques, minières se situeraient au niveau de l'Arctique, les choses sont en réalité beaucoup plus compliquées que ça et risquent de demander plus de temps qu'il n'y paraît. On sait, je vous donne quelques chiffres, qu'en termes d'exploitation minière ou énergétique, on considère que les coûts engagés serait en gros de 2 à 5 fois plus en moyenne que sur d'autres types de sites hors de l'Arctique. Donc c'est un élément à prendre en considération, sans compter toutes les difficultés liées aux glaces dérivantes, les icebergs. Donc on est vraiment dans une considération extrême qui nous amène quand même à prendre un peu de recul. Ensuite, ce qu'il faut regarder, c'est qu'on a aussi une dimension juridique à prendre en considération. C'est qu'au niveau de l'Arctique, une grosse partie des ressources sont des ressources en fait offshore et qu'on a actuellement une grande compétition juridique. Vous savez qu'il y a ce qu'on appelle le droit de la mer, issu de ce qu'on appelle la Convention de Montego, qui explique en gros que la zone économique exclusive, qui est relative à la souveraineté de l'État qui borde l'espace maritime en question, ou l'inverse plutôt, c'est 200 miles, donc en gros 300 km qui relèvent de la souveraineté de l'État. Donc de ce point de vue-là, la question juridique n'est pas forcément posée. Mais on a énormément de ressources qui se situent dans des zones offshore qui seraient, entre guillemets, liées plutôt aux eaux internationales. Et là, on a affaire en fait, à une véritable problématique de savoir qui peut exploiter en fait, ces ressources, d'autant plus qu'il y a une espèce de course aujourd'hui autour d'une zone qui est riche en matériaux stratégiques, riche en hydrocarbures, qui est ce qu'on appelle la dorsale de Lomonosov, qui se situe pas très loin de ce qui est le pôle Nord et qui est disputé en fait par un certain nombre d'États qui, au titre de ce qu'on appelle le plateau continental, c'est-à-dire la Convention de Montego Bay donne une distance de 200 miles, mais considère que si le plateau continental d'un pays poursuit au-delà, eh bien la souveraineté irait à ce pays. Et c'est là qu'on a une dispute, notamment entre la Russie, le Canada, la Norvège, en fait, sur certaines parties de ces zones, et à l'inverse des pays qui tentent à mettre en avant qu'au contraire, il s'agirait plutôt d'une zone qui pourrait être ouverte à ceux qui sont prêts à investir, et on se retrouve aujourd'hui dans une conflictualité qui est très forte. Et puis, il y a une dimension, enfin, sur laquelle il faut parler, c'est la question des routes maritimes. Aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup d'espoirs qui sont placés, en fait, sur l'éclosion de nouvelles routes maritimes commerciales qui passeraient justement par l'Arctique. Alors, on a plusieurs routes. On a la route dite Northern Sea Route, c'est ça, la route maritime du Nord ou du Nord-Est. C'est un corridor qui est déjà utilisé, en fait, qui longe les côtes russes. C'est la route arctique la plus opérationnelle. Et vous avez également une autre route, dite la Nord-Ouest Passage, ou Passage du Nord-Ouest, qui passe cette fois-ci plutôt par les eaux territoriales canadiennes, qui nous envoie vers une route qui est beaucoup plus complexe parce qu'elle est plus difficile à la navigation, avec une présence d'éléments importants de type glace dérivante ou iceberg qui rendent les choses difficiles, d'autant plus que le Canada, malgré sa position septentrionale, ne dispose pas des moyens technologiques en fait, pour assurer la viabilité de cette route. On a également le scénario de ce qui serait la Transpolar Sea Route, ou route transpolaire, cette fois-ci qui passerait au plus près du pôle Nord, qui serait une route plus directe et qui réglerait le problème juridique de la proximité notamment des côtes russes, parce que ça semble déranger un certain nombre d'acteurs dans le contexte actuel du conflit ukrainien. Et ce qu'il faut regarder également, c'est qu'au-delà de ces éléments, et c'est encore une limitation que je vais présenter, c'est que ces routes aujourd'hui sont utilisées de façon très marginale. Alors côté russe, il y a une utilisation notamment dans une dimension interne, plus du transit, on va dire, interne, qui est assuré notamment par la société russe Rosatom Flot, telle qu'elle s'appelle, et qui permet en fait l'exploitation notamment des ressources minières, énergétiques, matières premières russes tout le long de la côte arctique, avec un port très important qui est le port de Mourmansk. Et par contre, au niveau des échanges commerciaux internationaux, on considère qu'aujourd'hui, on a eu, et c'est un record, environ une centaine de transits qui se sont déroulés, qu'on a présentés comme un événement exceptionnel, en oubliant de dire que si on fait une comparaison, par exemple, avec le canal de Suez, on est sur un passage d'environ 20 000 navires par an, ou le détroit de Malacca, environ 100 000 navires par an, dans des tonnages en plus qui n'ont absolument rien à voir. Parce que lorsqu'on parle des routes du Nord, on est sur des petits tonnages, alors que les détroits ou le canal de Suez que je viens de vous présenter, on est sur un tonnage très important. Donc du coup, il y a évidemment des opportunités importantes économiquement sur la question des routes maritimes internationales, et en même temps des limitations, la difficulté à exploiter et également la viabilité des routes, qui nous amène peut-être à prendre un petit peu de recul lorsqu'on présente en fait l'Arctique comme un grand Eldorado ou une nouvelle péninsule arabique en quelque sorte énergétique, telle que ça peut être présenté dans certains titres de presse. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup, Hichem. My question to Ambassador Brunson. So in today's world, then the diplomacy is less and less important. We were not particularly surprised by the Charles' offer to buy Greenland to Denmark. So what is the chance to this deal to be successful? And what is the connection between Trump's peace plan on Ukraine and the point with Arctic in all this picture?
Before I get to Greenland, however, I want to do a little bit of scene setting, if I may. The Trump administration has four major areas of focus in foreign policy. They are Western Hemisphere, Russia, China, and the Middle East. Those are the big four. That's where most of the attention goes. So Western Hemisphere, Russia, China, Middle East. Three of those four areas have an Arctic dimension to them. The Arctic is important for Western Hemisphere, for Russia, for China. And this I think you have to keep in mind. It's not necessarily central to any of those areas, but it's heavily implicated in all of those foreign policy portfolios. So let's go through them a bit. The Western Hemisphere, that's the Monroe Doctrine. You've seen that the Trump administration is putting particular weight on that. The Arctic is the northern end of it, and it counts too. The Monroe Doctrine says no foreign military incursions will be allowed in the Western Hemisphere, but it goes a bit farther than that in practice to discouraging commercial efforts and other overt gestures by major foreign powers to have influence in the Western Hemisphere. It's a way of declaring that the Western Hemisphere is the U.S. sphere of influence. That's what it means. And in practical terms, that means that the Trump administration and the U.S. as a whole, including the business community, will fight very hard for commercial advantage in the Arctic. So to the extent that things do open up, whether it's petroleum or rare earths or whatever, the U.S. will try to be there in the Western Hemisphere and be the dominant partner. And they're also going to try to contest Russia's advances. I mean, Russia has the biggest fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers in the world, and the U.S. is way behind, but I think you're going to see a lot of construction of icebreakers, and particularly nuclear icebreakers. There are a couple of other dimensions, too, to the Arctic that are very important, and they are military security dimensions. Because the trade routes that pass there have to be secured, or at least will be secured by people who want to know who's using them. And you don't want to ever forget that the Arctic is the shortest path for an intercontinental ballistic missile coming from Russia, from China, from North Korea, three countries that have nuclear weapons and from time to time indicate they might be willing to use them. So that means that there is a missile defense military strategic element to the Arctic, which is in the background and everybody's thinking in Washington, you can be sure of that. Turning to Russia, well, as you know, the Trump administration wants to have rapprochement with Russia. Trump tried it in his first term, didn't get very far. He came in the second term hoping that he would be able to establish something right away. And you saw that at the Alaska summit very clearly. It's not just Donald Trump, it's also the American business community wants to do business in Russia and thinks that there is big opportunity there. Also geostrategically to prise Russia a bit loose anyway from the strong grip of China, where, as I think we will see, Russia's interest is also in coming closer to the United States. Now, as Hisham indicated, the Ukraine war has prevented the kind of quick embrace that Trump was after, but he hasn't given up on that. China, the third big priority, is very important, even though it's not an Arctic country. China aspires to be able to use the trade, the lines of communication. It is the shortest path between China and Europe for trade and transportation. And they also hope to exploit the Russian mineral and rare earth resources in potential future competition with the United States. And it is, because China is the main rival to the United States in geopolitical terms. The US will do what it can to slow the growth of China, to put obstacles in the way of China's policies, to contain, in a sense, it's a complicated sort of sticks and carrots type policy that you see being worked out right now even, but it will have an Arctic dimension too, and I think the US will do what it can to keep China as much out of the Arctic as it is possible. Okay, now coming closer to home, to Greenland. Trump started off right away offering to buy Greenland, suggesting that Canada might become the 51st state. How serious these particular announcements were, well, we shall see eventually. If you look at the map, and there are copies of this going around, it's worth taking a look at for those of us who are not great experts on the Arctic Circle. It's very interesting looking at this map. You can see why Greenland, part of the Western Hemisphere, and the closest into the North Pole of any of the countries, any of the 8 countries that are in the Arctic Circle, it's very important to the United States. I would just point out to you that Donald Trump is not alone in seeking greater American influence in Greenland. This is an old story. In the middle part of the 19th century, about the same time that the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia, the U.S. made an offer to Denmark to buy Greenland. It was turned down, but this was, over 150 years ago. And then again, in the early part of the 20th century, there were some negotiations about trading Greenland. Denmark was offered, as I recall, a piece of the Philippines, plus a solution to the Schleswig-Holstein problem. We were going to take that back from Germany and give it back to Denmark, and the price to pay would be Greenland. And this was like over 100 years ago. Harry Truman, a good Democrat, in the 40s, made a substantial offer about the equivalent of about $1 billion US in today's currency to buy Greenland. The Danes turned that down. So it's not exactly a new idea. It's been around for a long time. And if you look at the map, you can see why. Now, how hard is Donald Trump going to push on this? Well, I don't know. There are obstacles and there are other priorities. He's got other things to worry about, including the Russia portfolio and the Ukraine war. He's got the Middle East, which is going in a good direction, according to Trump, but isn't sorted out yet. And the whole business of the relationship with China, friendly enemies, that is still to sort out too. So I would not put Greenland as on the very top of Donald Trump's priority list, but neither will he forget about it, so it will probably come back at some point, and there will be some further engagement. The thing about the Arctic that you see from this map quite clearly is that Russia is the dominant player, 11 time zones out of the 24. But guess what? Now with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the US-led alliance, or call it Team USA, if you will, Team USA has 13 time zones. So the Russians have a big lead. They were there first. They had the ideas first, and they acted on their ideas earlier than anybody else. But the stakes are high also for the U.S.-led alliance, and there's going to be a lot of action in the Arctic, but maybe not right away because of other priorities.
And this plan on Ukraine and points on Arctic. So what is the connection?
Well, what is the connection? Well, for Trump, Ukraine doesn't count, except that it's the obstacle to rapprochement, détente with Russia. That's what it's all about. You can see that very clearly if you just look at how Trump treats Zelensky on one hand, Putin on the other. The peace talks, which probably will not come to fruition, let's be honest, that probably isn't going to work. Instead, you're going to have some sort of frozen conflict to end the fighting. But the peace talks occur between Washington and Moscow. Nobody else is in there. They get briefed afterwards. So that's the connection. Donald Trump wants good relations with Russia because of the Arctic, among other things, space and high tech and all sorts of things. And he can't get it because Ukraine is standing in the way. So that's the connection. Ukraine is the stumbling block, and it seems to be a pretty big stumbling block too. Okay, that's enough for now.
Dr. Fleming, if I may ask you honest answer, how Denmark reacted to the idea of Donald Trump to buy Greenland, and how do you see the risk of the, direct confrontation between Kingdom of Denmark and the USA?
Thank you for this. I'll just stand up so people in the back may also see me. So thank you for this, and thank you for the invitation. It's my first time here. And it's my pleasure, of course, to address you on what is a quite acute topic for us, relationship between the Kingdom of Denmark. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, the Kingdom of Denmark consists of Denmark, Faroe Islands, and of course Greenland. So Denmark is part of the Arctic because of Greenland. So relations between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US. Before I answer your question, let me just try to paint or set the scene, because we need to understand, all of us, that there are a number of conflicts in the Arctic. So now we speak about the Arctic as a new strategic frontier, but we have a number of conflicts. First, we have a conflict which is quite mild. It's played out in a mild, sort of friendly manner, but it concerns the resources in the Arctic. And there is a kind of El Dorado, but the El Dorado is for the states that are the Arctic states. So Arctic states have access to the resources, and we are all trying to define our access, the continental shelves, to see what kind of resources we have access to. And the biggest conflict that we have had is actually between the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada. So we have famously a dispute over the island Hans Island, which is a small island situated between Greenland and Canada. And there is a territorial conflict between the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada over this. And troops from both countries sort of play on this. It's reported that Canadian troops will arrive on Hans Island. They will place a bottle of whiskey. Danish troops will arrive and they will take the bottle of whiskey and drink it, and they'll replace it with a bottle of Danish schnapps. And so this is the character of the conflict, but there is a resource conflict which is being played out. Then, of course, we have a political conflict, military conflict, which has exacerbated since 2014. And we've seen a rise in the militarization of the Arctic. It's been underway for some time. We've seen it mainly in the Russian part of the Arctic. Russia has emphasized its access, and we just learned the fastest way, the shortest way for an intercontinental ballistic missile to be sent from Russia is over the Arctic. So there is a political military dimension, a conflict which has been exacerbated since 2014, and has been so especially now with the admission of Finland and Sweden to NATO. So we now have a situation where in the Arctic we have 7 Arctic states plus Russia. And the 7 Arctic states are all members of NATO. And then we have a more recent conflict, which of course is between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US. And it's a very serious conflict for us. It's, it has happened before, clearly, but when we look at the various examples, we go back to very traditional power politics. So a situation where states would just buy territory. So the idea that you could buy territory, even if Greenland at the time seemed of very little value because you couldn't access the resources. Still today it's very difficult to access the resources that are in the underground. But the idea of purchasing territory just for the sake of territory itself, when territoriality was very important, we have to go back in history. So when Donald Trump during his first presidency suddenly suggested that he would buy Greenland as a kind of real estate deal, our Prime Minister famously said that this was absurd. And Donald Trump took great offense from this. Now the situation is different. There is a suggestion now to buy Greenland, but there is also a suggestion to take Greenland by military means. And so the pressure has been stepped up. It's a serious situation. When Donald Trump Jr. traveled to Greenland in January, and I speak about this as if you all know, you probably didn't notice. But Donald Trump Jr. traveled to Greenland in January on a personal trip, so he said. He went to Greenland for a few days, a few hours, sorry. He went to Nuuk, the capital city of Greenland. He conducted what, in my opinion, clearly was an information operation. And we need to be able to speak about this openly. So they conducted an information and influence operation designed to influence the Greenlandic public and the US public. And this was the first sign that something was really happening. And since then we have increased our attention to this. We now have, for unknown reasons, but we have a night watch in the Danish Foreign Ministry in Copenhagen who follows events in the US and prepares a report every night that has to be ready by 7 o'clock. And this, I don't know why it's not done in our embassy in Washington, but someone in the Foreign Ministry in Copenhagen has a night watch simply to follow this and to bring to the attention of policymakers if something has happened. So there is a sense of urgency. We've seen the appointment of a new US ambassador who was actually in Greenland yesterday for his first meeting, and he has one task, which is to increase US influence over Greenland. And he did a press conference, which was announced at very short notice. So Danish media was unable to attend, but Greenlandic media was able to attend. And in the press conference, in the communique that was read out, Denmark is not mentioned by the new US ambassador, but Greenland is mentioned. So we see this as a sign also, an attempt to sort of create friction between Greenland and Denmark. So it's a very serious situation. Let me just add to this list of issues to set the scene for what we'll be discussing later. It regards China, because we have now a new situation also. So we have the resource dispute, conflict. We have conflict between Russia and the other Arctic states that are now all part of NATO. We have the conflict between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US. And now we also have a dispute over who should have access to the Arctic. And China clearly has an interest in the Arctic. It famously defines itself as a near-Arctic state. And until 2022, the Russians were adamant, as were also the other Arctic states, that the Arctic region is only for the Arctic states. But since 2022, Russia has opened the back door for China to enter the Arctic. And of course, it's kind of the price that Russia has to pay for Chinese support because of the war in Ukraine. So there is a new dispute. And you'll remember, again, this is not new, you'll remember that the US, even back in the first Trump presidency, Mike Pompeo was foreign minister, and he made a famous speech in which he made clear that this area is for the US. Russia should withdraw and China should stay out. So that's a new dispute which is emerging, that Russia has opened the back door. So it used to be Russian policy that the Arctic region is only for the Arctic states. Now in its new strategy papers, it announces that any state that is willing to take a constructive approach to the problems of the Arctic is welcome in the Arctic. And this is something that the other Arctic states will also have to deal with. But to sum up, the question about Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland, and the US is an acute issue for us, and there is a great concern that the US will really flex its muscles, whatever muscles, all kinds of muscles that it has, to try to win over Greenland.
But if we imagine a real confrontation, what?
There will not be a real confrontation. Now, it's interesting to hear, of course, that there is this US interest in Greenland. It has been. Part of it used to be, as I said, territoriality. There are certain states that think in territories in different ways in Switzerland and Denmark will do. You know, they think in expansion. They like this idea of large territory, a territory that is ill-defined in a way, a territory that is expanded upon. And that used to be part of the old rationale for this. Now we hear about military issues, and they're quite real. But the point is that the US has access to Greenland. So there's a US military base on Greenland, which used to host, during the Cold War, maybe as many as 2,000 US troops. Now it hosts maybe 200. But the US is free to increase the number of troops in the base. It's free to set up new bases without permission. And of course, if the US was generally concerned about these issues, it would have done something about them earlier. So we learned about nuclear icebreakers, for instance. The US doesn't have an icebreaker fleet. And so if the US was generally concerned about this, it would have started the development of an icebreaker fleet maybe 20 years ago. But it didn't. So we see this is my opinion also when I look at what is being said, it's my opinion that it's being used in a way as an excuse to say to the Kingdom of Denmark, accuses the Kingdom of Denmark of having failed to meet the military requirements that are necessary today, and therefore we need to take over Greenland to address this issue. But there will not be a direct military confrontation. There's nothing that Denmark can do. I mean, Greenland doesn't have a military. Denmark has a military, and the Danish military is present in Greenland, but it's not in a position, of course, to fight the US.
Thank you very much, Isham. So as already was mentioned, Finland and Sweden, they joined NATO, and the Western security arc became much larger. So is Europe ready economically, politically, militarily to the new confrontation with Russia in Arctic, having the war in Ukraine, which is still not finished and we don't know when it will be finished?
Très bien. Alors, je sais pas, il faut que je me mette debout aussi.
Par rapport à la question qui est de savoir, entre guillemets, le lien qui pourrait exister entre ce qui se déroule au niveau de l'Arctique, la course à l'Arctique, hein, cette espèce de nouveau jeu stratégique de chercher à contrôler en fait cette zone, et les retombées sur l'Ukraine. Alors ce qui est intéressant de regarder, c'est qu'en fait on a deux mouvements qui peuvent être deux mouvements contradictoires. C'est que d'une part, les opportunités en fait qui existent hein, dans toute cette grande région arctique, quelque part, je pense, ont joué beaucoup, peut-être dans le repositionnement américain en direction de la Russie. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, les États-Unis ont bien conscience qu'ils sont très très en retard hein, dans cette course à l'Arctique par rapport à une situation d'asymétrie des moyens. Comme ça a été indiqué, donc on a vraiment une grande asymétrie des moyens en ce sens où, si on doit faire un comparatif en fait, des moyens technologiques, on a une supériorité quasi absolue de la Russie dans la région. On a parlé avec toute cette flotte de brise-glace hein, qui remonte à l'ère soviétique, qui est aujourd'hui inconcurrençable, que ce soit du point de vue des capacités techniques ou du point de vue de la technologie. C'est-à-dire qu'on a quasiment un retard d'une génération. Bon, les États-Unis, avec leur puissance industrielle telle qu'elle existe encore dans certains domaines, pourraient le rattraper, mais demanderaient un effort de 20 à 30 ans. Même les Chinois, qui ne font pas partie hein, de la zone arctique, mais qui ont une politique proactive à travers ce qu'on appelle le projet des routes de la soie polaire, hein, c'est comme ça qu'elle s'appelle, eh bien, est beaucoup plus présente avec deux brise-glaces, alors qui ne sont pas nucléaires, mais qui sont des brise-glaces de dernière génération. En fait, la Russie se trouve en position de quasi-monopole. C'est-à-dire que si demain la région devait se développer économiquement et pouvait offrir en fait tous les avantages comparatifs que l'on attend, la possibilité d'exploiter les ressources énergétiques minières prétendues comme telles, eh bien on se retrouvait dans une situation où de toute façon la Russie serait incontournable, et quel que soit le discours ou le positionnement qui pourrait être celui de l'OTAN, de dire qu'aujourd'hui l'OTAN s'est élargie, et c'est un paradoxe sur lequel on va revenir, eh bien la Russie se trouve en position centrale. Ensuite, ce qu'il faut regarder par rapport à la question ukrainienne, c'est que d'une part, on peut considérer alors effectivement que les États-Unis, ayant besoin de rattraper un petit peu sur leur positionnement, tentent de se rapprocher de la Russie, également pour exploiter les ressources énergétiques. Et je pense à ce qui a été discuté récemment lors de la rencontre entre le président Trump et Poutine, notamment sur la question de l'exploitation d'un certain nombre de ressources énergétiques, avec en tête de pont Exxon, qui compte investir des dizaines de milliards de dollars en Sibérie et dans la zone arctique. Donc on est dans quelque chose qui relève du big business, et que les Américains ont pu faire un calcul très simple. Continuer à soutenir l'Ukraine à bout de bras nous permet certes d'avoir des opportunités de maintenir l'appareil militaro-industriel, mais coûte beaucoup. Alors que peut-être la Russie, en termes d'opportunités et entre guillemets de gains, nous promet la possibilité d'exploiter avec eux des ressources énergétiques importantes. Il y a cet élément. Mais il y a aussi un autre élément, c'est qu'à travers, et ça c'est le paradoxe de la guerre en Ukraine, eh bien l'extension de l'OTAN, notamment au niveau des pays scandinaves, on parle de la Norvège, enfin de la Suède, la Finlande, eh bien la proximité de l'OTAN vis-à-vis de la Russie se fait de plus en plus importante, et on est dans une logique d'encerclement de la Russie d'un point de vue du positionnement géographique. Mais du point de vue de la puissance fonctionnelle, j'ai envie de dire que pour le moment, ça ne change rien à la donne. Ça ne change rien à la donne. L'OTAN peut être plus proche de la Russie à travers la Finlande peut-être, mais en termes de confrontation militaire, la Russie a une avance considérable parce qu'elle a investi en fait ces dernières années, que ce soit à travers ces systèmes d'armes totalement adaptés à la dimension arctique et conditions climatiques, et également par rapport à ce que l'on disait, est-ce que les brise-glaces nucléaires servent pour la navigation civile, mais servent aussi pour la navigation militaire. Et en fait, on est toujours dans cette asymétrie, moi qui me laisse à penser qu'il y a des intentions, il y a un repositionnement, il y a une course à l'Arctique qui porte une dimension militaire, mais en même temps, on est dans cette asymétrie qui fait que peut-être l'Arctique va être un argument fort pour amener les États-Unis à se rapprocher de plus en plus de la Russie vis-à-vis de la politique de containment, entre guillemets, de la Chine, mais vis-à-vis également de ses intérêts stratégiques et de ses intérêts économiques. Et ce n'est pas pour rien que le président Trump fait le forcing sur le Groenland, à défaut de pouvoir rattacher le Groenland au territoire des États-Unis, d'avoir des concessions et d'être en pole position sur ce territoire, avec peut-être un deal qui n'est pas dit, eh bien, lâche-moi l'Ukraine et je te laisse le Groenland. Et ça, c'est peut-être quelque chose qui est à considérer à terme. Puis, au-delà de ça, on parlait du scénario, entre guillemets, d'un affrontement entre le Danemark et les États-Unis. Bon, évidemment, scénario impossible, hein, dans le sens où on est entre le bœuf et la fourmi ou autre chose, un autre comparatif. Ce qui est intéressant de voir, c'est que, d'une part, le Danemark considère les États-Unis comme aujourd'hui un problème, un adversaire sérieux par rapport à sa souveraineté, mais ce ne l'a pas empêché, lorsqu'il s'est agi eh bien, de faire des commandes de systèmes aériens, notamment d'avions, mais d'acheter des F-35 qui, si le Danemark devait les utiliser pour se défendre, seraient tout simplement cloués au sol, incapables de pouvoir décoller, commandés à distance par la technologie qui est celle du producteur, c'est-à-dire des États-Unis. Et donc là, on a quand même un élément qui peut être une ouverture dans la discussion, qui va plus loin que le Danemark, c'est la position de l'Europe. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, et particulièrement avec les derniers propos qui étaient tenus à niveau stratégique aux États-Unis, l'Europe est considérée comme un rival des États-Unis. Et ça a été le cas depuis la fin de la guerre froide. Si on regarde par exemple toute la littérature stratégique des années 90, l'Europe est considérée comme une véritable obsession stratégique des États-Unis, à un moment où le différentiel économique semblait peut-être devenir plus favorable à l'Europe, à l'Union européenne qu'aux États-Unis. Et aujourd'hui, cette vision, c'est-à-dire de l'Europe en tant que rival stratégique des États-Unis, même si aujourd'hui l'Europe est plutôt un vassal, existe toujours. Et du point de vue européen, il n'y a toujours pas de prise en considération aujourd'hui que les États-Unis sont un acteur géopolitique et stratégique comme d'autres acteurs, et qu'en réalité, les Européens sont en rivalité avec les États-Unis sur la question arctique et d'autres dossiers, mais ne met peut-être pas les moyens dans l'analyse de ce qui est en train de se dérouler aujourd'hui. Et lorsqu'on parle justement d'extension de l'OTAN, c'est plutôt les États-Unis qui avancent au détriment de l'Europe, et pourquoi pas imaginer à terme, si on devait opérer un vote au Groenland, que les populations du Groenland décident d'être rattachées aux États-Unis, puisque la grande majorité, plus de 90% selon ces sondages, voudraient devenir indépendants. Si demain les Américains, Donald Trump arrive en disant « je promets $100 000 à chaque habitant du Groenland », je ne suis pas sûr que ces derniers ne souhaiteraient pas devenir américains. Après tout, les États-Unis, c'était une très grande nation, très grand pays, qui, en plus de cela, leur permettrait bien de disposer d'énormes opportunités en tant que citoyens. Et donc, ce n'est pas forcément un scénario qu'on pourrait rejeter, en tout cas à première vue.
Thank you, Shem. So, about independence of Greenland, if you can talk about this. And also the question which goes from Hishem's speech about NATO and Europe. So even in negotiations about Ukraine between Russia and USA, we see that Europe is out. So what's going on with Europe's role? What's going on with NATO? How do you see the future scenarios? And starting with Greenland independence.
Great, thank you. Very exciting. Starting with Greenlandic independence. Well, I have to be very careful with what I say because it's a very sensitive issue because there is a strong sense in Greenland, of course, that Greenland may actually become independent, and there's a strong secessionist movement. It has been my assessment that we should prepare for Greenlandic independence within maybe a decade or two. Now it's been accelerated. Not so much independence perhaps, but a different status for Greenland. And of course now when we speak about possible US takeover of Greenland, we need to understand also that it will not be a federal state. It will have a different status. It will be a different kind of territory. But Greenland now is somewhere between the Kingdom of Denmark. It's still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it's edging towards the exit. And then on the other side, of course, the US. So it's a difficult situation. For those of you who are not familiar with Greenland, you can see it on the map. It's quite misrepresented. It's not that big, but it is huge. It has a population of about 50,000 people. So the idea of independence definitely is difficult. So enough said about that. One thing that it's difficult for us to see a tie between what's happening in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, and what's happening in Greenland. But if we lift it to the uppermost level, we sense that this is a particular approach to world politics. It's a particular approach to order. I did a piece at the Danish Institute for International Studies where I work. I did this in January, it came out, and it was on Russian military thinking about the Arctic. And I needed to include in it US advances towards Greenland. Now I mentioned Donald Trump Jr. who did this information operation, influence operation in Greenland. He was in Nuuk, he traveled from Nuuk to Florida, and his dad did a press conference where he talked about the possible takeover of Greenland. And I needed to include that in the work that I did, and I did so very quickly, and I looked at Russian responses, and they were like, this is totally unacceptable, it violates international law, there's no way that we can condone this. And then the piece came out, and a few weeks later, Russian President Putin suddenly announced that perhaps the US has a historic claim to Greenland. And you will find in this, of course, in a way, let me just be brutally honest, the perversion of history, where you will use history to justify some of these things. So Putin now supports the idea that the US should take over. And in a way, you can see the link when you elevate it to the highest level. It's about world order. It's about how states operate, how big states, major states operate on the international scene. Now, NATO. Where does NATO stand and where does Europe stand? Well, NATO is in a poorer place today than it was on the 20th of January when Trump was inaugurated. And if we want to keep the ties and connect all the dots, we can see, at least from the point that the US were threatening to use military force against Greenland, to take over Greenland, and the Kingdom of Denmark, of course, is part of NATO. And what happened is that two major European NATO member states, France and Germany, came out in support of the Kingdom of Denmark. So you had a situation in January where the US was threatening to use military means against another NATO member state. And two major European NATO member states came out to support this second NATO member state. That's not good news for NATO. So NATO is in a poorer state, in my opinion, than it used to be, and as it was before the inauguration of Trump on the 20th of January. And there are many reasons for this. If we look at the most recent, or the new US security strategy, which is a very important piece of thinking, it has far-reaching implications. It says something about Greenland also. It doesn't mention Greenland, but it does say something about Greenland because it talks about the establishment of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And to exclude other actors from getting access to critical resources in that particular domain. So that's very important. It doesn't say anything about Greenland, and I can see from my colleagues at home, they've been very different in their interpretations. Some say it doesn't say anything about Greenland, now let's celebrate. Others say no, it talks about the establishment of US dominance in the Western Hemisphere. That's very bad news for Greenland. So it talks about that, but it also talks about NATO. And it says that NATO member states, European NATO member states, are undergoing transformation. We may understand this as demographic transformations that may render some of these European NATO member states untrustworthy allies in the future. And that's also problematic, of course, for NATO. And it's directed at particularly the European states that are also members of the European Union. So the US national security strategy talks about a civilizational shift in Europe, which will transform the way that we view politics. And we may not be close allies of the US unless we correct this. So I think NATO is in a relatively poor state, I have to say. We may imagine all kinds of scenarios. One could be the development of kind of European NATO within NATO. So we speak about the Arctic. One area, one region of great interest right now, and I encourage you to look at this, would be the Nordic-Baltic region. We call it the NB8. Lots of things are happening. So it's the 5 Nordic states plus the 3 Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Sometimes we even open the door and we allow the Germans and the Poles inside. And then we have a very strong regional cooperation. So we can imagine different scenarios playing out, but one would be a European NATO within NATO. The US is still part of it, but there is a fragmentation and other states are moving in different directions. So that could be one scenario at least.
Maybe you can develop a few scenarios?
Well, other scenarios would be the collapse of NATO. And it's something that we have to also be prepared for. Obviously, we have to be prepared. And it doesn't have to be super dramatic. We had an incident now when the US failed to be present at a meeting, and it was sort of toned down, and people say, well, everyone is busy and that's it. But we can have a NATO summit meeting and suddenly the US president does not attend. It's not super dramatic, but it does great damage to NATO. We can imagine also a situation, let's say following the next US presidential election, where NATO will partly recover, but the question remains whether the European allies are ready for that. My best interpretation of that would be no, we are not. So the damage has already been done in the transatlantic relationship. There is a sense, as someone mentioned it, I was attending a meeting, and another speaker said, we cannot live in a world where we're only 4 years away from total chaos. So we need to prepare ourselves for total chaos, and it means that we need to be less dependent on the US. It's not something that we can fix right away because we have grown extremely dependent on the US, but there are now movements. You will see this now within the European Union. We have a defense commissioner for the first time. There are movements now to decrease European dependence on the US, but it will take at least a decade. And that's a very problematic situation. So, but yeah, the collapse of NATO is also a scenario, absolutely and unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I mean, Ambassador McKinley, you already talked about USA, who doesn't want China to come to Arctic, but what they can do if China use the same methods, like buying, or more, let's say, investing, using political tools. So how really USA can block China to become the third Arctic power? And the second question will be, if the peace plan of Trump will fail on Ukraine, how it will influence plan of Trump to cooperate with Russia in Arctic?
I think NATO is not going to collapse. I think it will struggle on. I mean, NATO, in a sense, lost its raison d'etre in 1991, but it's still here. And the reason it's still here is because it is in the interest of the United States to keep its traditional European allies under its wing, shall we say. And it is in the interests of the European allies to continue to enjoy the US nuclear umbrella, which is what NATO is at its core. That's really what it is when you get right down to it. It's the protection offered by the US nuclear umbrella against the possibility of attack by other nuclear powers. So I think up to now, the rationale for NATO continues to be valid and will for the foreseeable future. Now, of course, in Europe there is the kind of neo-Gaullist sentiment that Europe should get out from under the wing of the United States and should become a power in its own right. And this is a very attractive scenario to certain Europeans. But I think it's an unrealistic one, to be honest. Charles de Gaulle himself didn't get very far with it when you get right down to it. And today, the Europe of 27 nations with quite different attitudes in the foreign policy and the strategic field, without a common army, common command structure, common government, common budget, is not really in a position to rise up to the ranks of a superpower in the military terms. It's just not possible, given the way Europe is structured. To say nothing of the budget questions, most European governments are deeply indebted. They're having a lot of trouble paying off their borrowing, paying off the interest on their debt, and paying for very elaborate welfare systems. This is part of the criticism in the new security document. You might call it the J.D. Vance point of view. He likes to accuse the Europeans of egotistically free riding and not taking life seriously. But it is true that no European government, and no group of European governments really has the money to spend on the military or on an independent nuclear deterrent that would be taken seriously as a superpower. And without that, you have to be under somebody's wing. And for Europe, the choice is basically the U.S. wing or the Russian wing. And I think we know which wing most Europeans would choose. You asked, what can the U.S. do to keep China out of the Arctic? Well, that depends on the Russia strategy, really. If Trump succeeds in cozying up to Russia, he'll have a much greater chance of making life difficult for the Chinese also in the Arctic, across the board, as Hichem said. It's part of the encirclement strategy. If you want to strengthen the ability of the countries all around China to resist the enormous dynamism of China and continue to live in at least with one foot in the Western world, well, that goes for Russia as well as for Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and the rest. But if Trump fails in his policy of rapprochement with Russia, then there isn't so much that he can do to keep the Chinese out of the Arctic. He's not going to go to war with China. He's not going to start sinking Chinese icebreakers. It will be part of a complicated strategy. I said before, sticks and carrots. I mean, ways to punish and impede China, but also to direct its dynamism in ways which are useful to the United States. It's a complicated game. It's a long game. And if Trump fails to revive the U.S. industrial sector, if he fails in his policy vis-a-vis Russia, China is well positioned to continue to grow. And the encirclement strategy, the neighbors of China will be put, will be confronted with a very difficult decision, as they already are to a degree, but it will become more and more difficult for them to have to choose. And in a way, you could say Europe is also in that position, because the Chinese have a lot of money, and they're willing to use it also in Europe, and that day may come too. But the geopolitics are basically the two big superpowers, and Russia in the middle being fought over by the two, and in a position to play one of the two against the other, play the two against each other. And that's the major dynamic for the rest of the 21st century, I think. I don't see either the EU or India rising up to become the fourth and the fifth superpowers to further complicate the game. I think it's going to be among those three. And that's not all bad news, because in the unipolar moment, when the US felt free to go around the world doing whatever it wanted, a lot of bad things happened. Now that the US has realized there are some limits to the exercise of its power, and those limits are, in fact, the other two superpowers, they're going to be more careful, more cautious, I think.
Thank you very much, dear experts, for sharing your vision. Thank you very much, our dear audience, for your attention and your interest. Now we welcome you to Apéro. It's a wine provided by winemaker Ion Gerciu, Swiss Moldavian wine, which he donated for all of us. I hope you will enjoy it, and I wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.